The young man I am going to introduce is the youngest member of the United States Senate. He came to the Senate from the state Senate, where he pioneered a number of activities. He was with Pat O'Malley and a number of others, known as the Fab Five, in the Illinois State Senate. He was designated as a sure loser when the establishment of the Republican Party came out for someone that it favored for United States Senate. The governor came out for Lolita Dietrichson, and the editorial boards, in their collective wisdom, shook their gray heads and thought this young man was a marginal candidate. It was, I think, at the City Club debate on Channel 11, Jay, that placed him right on the ascendancy. It was one of the history of the City Club is marked with debates, and Peter Fitzgerald did extraordinarily well in that debate. In the United States Senate, he has decided not to take a back seat as usual freshmen are and just shut up and watch some of the leadership. He has stood up for a number of things that people felt needed saying against the airline bailout that was given. He was one of the, if not the only vote, one of the few votes against it. He's a member of a very important committee, Commerce Committee, which governs just about everything, I think, in the United States. He is a conservative with heart, a compassionate person, a guy who, when he walks into a room, you know that you're not going to get the usual political palaver. You're going to get something that is far different. It's our honor at the City Club of Chicago to introduce United States Senator Peter Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please. Tom, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I would be remiss if I didn't actually point out that since Mr. Cruikshank is here from the Sun-Times, that in fact in that primary, the Chicago Sun-Times did endorse me, as well as the Daily Herald. So I didn't want you to think that all of the gray editorial boards were against me, and so I want to give appropriate thanks to those who were for me, and all of you for being here. This is really a wonderful turnout. The City Club of Chicago has a distinguished history dating back to 1903, and it seems to me that the City Club is really more vibrant than ever now. It was very vibrant at the turn of the century. It was very involved in uncovering corruption in the police department in the city of Chicago. It's had a distinguished history ever since, and I congratulate all those who've worked so hard to keep it vigorous. I'm delighted to be here today. Yesterday I was traveling with the President. I came from Washington aboard Air Force One. The President was in our state in far western Illinois in East Moline, speaking at a John Deere plant, and it was his first trip following his incident on Sunday with the famous pretzel. And the President actually did very well yesterday. When I saw him aboard Air Force One, he did look tired. He said that he had had some kind of a head cold or maybe the flu, and he was eating one of those, I took it to be one of those real thick pretzels, not an ordinary little pretzel, and that it actually may have stimulated that vagal nerve, as they say, that may have caused him to faint. In any case, yesterday he was very vigorous. He got very pumped up speaking to the crowd of employees at the John Deere Harvester Works plant, and I'm sure that our President is fine. He is a very athletic President. He runs a 7-minute mile. He gets up early every morning and runs several miles a day. He lifts weights. He's a very strong and healthy president. It was good to be with him today. I want to take up a couple of issues. I do want to address the aviation situation in Chicago. I think that is one of the most critical issues facing our state. And in fact, aviation is one of the most critical issues facing our whole country right now. But I also want to address and talk briefly about the Enron corporation collapse, because clearly that is now dominating the news. And my committee, the Senate Commerce Committee, was one of the first committees to hold congressional hearings on this. We had testimony from Arthur Anderson, the Chicago-based accounting firm, that I would say was probably had one of the best reputations of any accounting firm in the country. It was where the very best accountants went to work. It's a distinguished firm. Clearly, they've gotten embroiled in the middle of a great controversy since so many investors lost their wealth in Enron stock. Enron had a market capitalization of some $60 billion. It was a phenomenon throughout the 1990s with constant increasing revenues, and without ever reporting any losses, it just filed for bankruptcy. So it is really a huge, huge story, and it presents all sorts of issues. You've probably all heard every day there's a new Senate or House committee announcing a hearing on it. My committee is going to go back and have more hearings with Ken Lay, the chief executive of Enron, on February 4th. A number of other congressional committees have gotten in on the act. And I think the fact of the matter is there are many issues present, and that's why there's so many congressional committees that actually have jurisdiction here. The first thing I want to talk about, I know originally the media was very intent on finding out whether the Bush administration had in any way done anything to help Enron or to try and stave off its collapse. And clearly Enron and its managers, its executives, had been strong supporters of President Bush throughout his political career. And based on what we know now, however, it appears that the administration did not accede to the corporation's request for aid in October as it was going down. There were calls to the Treasury Secretary O'Neill and also to Commerce Secretary Don Evans, and he was on the trip yesterday on Air Force One and was talking about that on the talk shows over the weekend. They were both asked to assist. They asked Secretary Evans to assist by calling the ratings agency Moody's to help prevent a downgrade of Enron stock, which they thought would kind of feed the death spiral the company was in. And in fact, Don Evans did not call Moody's. He listened politely, but he told me that he thought that it would have been a major mistake for him to do that. He thought if he were to interfere in a rating agency's ratings of the securities of Enron, and people later relied on that rating agency's rating of the company's debt or stock, that in fact he could be contributing to the misleading of investors around the country. And he concluded it was not right, and he therefore did not act. Also, the Treasury Department was asked to arrange, kind of obliquely asked to arrange a bailout. There were calls not only to Treasury Secretary O'Neill, Paul O'Neill, but to his undersecretary, Peter Fisher. And Fisher was asked several times whether it was possible that the government might be able to put together a support package, as it did in the case of long-term capital management, that big hedge fund that went belly up a few years back, and under Treasury Secretary Bob Rubin, under the Clinton administration, they in fact did put together a package, not to save long-term capital management, but in fact to save the lenders, those who had lent money to long-term capital management. They helped them get paid off. Query whether that was a necessary or wise bailout. But the Treasury Department did not take any actions to arrange a bailout package, in contrast to the airline industry that just a few days after September 11th came to Capitol Hill, requested a bailout, and received a bailout with bipartisan support. In the Senate, everybody, Tom, voted for it except me. In the House, there were a number of people who voted against it. And the airline industry, in my judgment, is much like Enron insofar as it has enormous political clout on Capitol Hill. The airline industry put 63 lobbyists lobbying for its bailout. They had their first meetings immediately following the crashes on September 11th, and they put together a package of that immediately they ran to several leading members of both parties in Congress and to the White House and did get support for that bailout. But I'm thankful here that no effort was made to save Enron. I don't think it would have been necessary. But several things I think are going to happen. I think, number one, you are going to have to see, in my judgment, some effort to separate the accounting firms that do the auditing of the books of corporations. We're going to have to separate their auditors from their consulting side of their business. In the case of Arthur Andersen, they were earning millions of dollars from doing audits for Enrons and certifying their books, but at the same time they were taking management consulting fees for advising Enron on the management of their company. And many people have suggested that that presents a conflict of interest. I tend to agree with that. It's not easy to how we solve this, but in fact, the former chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission, Arthur Levitt, had proposed an SEC crackdown on accounting firms and had sought to separate their accounting from their consulting functions. I think that may be something that ultimately happens as a result of the Enron collapse. Secondly, how many of you watch those analysts on CNBC or ever watch Lou Dobbs' Moneyline? Come on, there's got to be more than you. Please raise your hand. Now, when you hear an analyst on Lou Dobbs touting some hot stock, how many of you think you should go out and rely on that you're getting independent, objective advice? Well, this is a very sophisticated audience. When you hear somebody on Lou Dobbs, you shouldn't necessarily run out and buy whatever stock they're touting because, in fact, many of these analysts, almost all of the analysts, work for the investment bank that is in turn providing investment banking services to the company. And most investors don't realize this, but a company like Enron, for example, is buying investment banking services from all the big investment banks, Merrill Lynch and everybody else, and they are, in essence, paying the investment banks to do the analysis that is coming, that the public looks at. Now, in the case of Enron, as late as September of 2001, there were 17 analysts who were analyzing Enron stock. 16 of them, as late as September, had buy or strong buy recommendations out on Enron stock. And only one of them, I think, had a hold. I don't think any of them had a sell. I'd have to check that. I've forgotten now. But that gives you an idea that the analysts who are advising investors around the country, and many people rely on these. We had all the employees of, several employees of Enron testify before our committee. I asked them, how many of you were relying on what the analysts were saying about Enron stock? And they all raised their hand. They said they were all relying on it. They said they figured that those analysts knew what they were talking about. They didn't want to sell the stock in their 401k accounts because they thought the prospects for Enron were good. Well, I think there's going to have to be a crackdown on analysts. Either that or there's got to be some huge disclaimer so that average investors understand they can't or shouldn't necessarily rely on anything that those analysts are saying when they're in fact being paid by the companies indirectly to produce those analyses. Another issue is the 401k plans. You've heard about all the Enron employees who had their whole life savings in their 401ks, and most of their 401k money was invested in Enron stock. Well, that's not a good idea. We all know about the idea of diversifying your portfolio. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Sometimes it works out really well when you have all your eggs in one basket and you get a great stock. In the case of Enron, it appeared that way for many years, but ultimately nothing was there. Another issue are just some of the accounting rules. The New York Times yesterday had a very good front page report on how there really wasn't as much to Enron as there appeared to be to the investing public. Enron claimed that its revenues per year were $100 billion a year. They claimed $100 billion in revenues in 2000, making them the 7th largest company in America, after like General Electric and General Motors and Exxon Mobil and a few others. Well, just a year before, they had said that their revenues were $40 billion. Well, how did Enron get such huge revenues? It turns out that the way Enron was counting its revenues, it had a huge energy trading business where they'd trade contracts for electricity for clients. A company in Chicago could buy millions of dollars worth of electricity to be delivered under a contract, kind of like an unregulated futures exchange. Well, Enron was counting as revenues the total value of their customer trades. They weren't simply counting the amount that they, Enron, would take as a commission. And so that was goosing their revenues. And really, all Enron was keeping out of that $100 billion was a small fraction. But clearly, the accounting rules allowed them to book that $100 billion as revenues, but it really wasn't there. And when the company thought it had $100 billion in revenues, it started thinking that these were $100 billion in real revenues. That facilitated them borrowing as much as $30 billion, because it kind of appeared that they were a much bigger corporation than they actually were. So some of the accounting rules may themselves have to be changed. This presents further interesting issues because Congress has never historically involved itself in what the accounting rules are. And that has always been left up to the Society of CPAs. And I know we have some CPAs in the audience. They have always made their own rules. They've had the Financial Accounting Standards Boards that have come up with what the good accounting ideas are, and Congress historically hasn't interfered with that. And there is no regulation at the federal level of those rules. This whole Enron debacle may invite some regulation in that regard. So it's a fascinating issue. It is as important as I think the media has been portraying it. I believe Newsweek's cover story this week was about the Enron collapse. It is a big story. There's a lot of issues here, and I think we'll be hearing about it for months to come, potentially. So with that, I do want to move to O'Hare, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions. How much time do you want me to leave for questions, Tom?
Well, why don't you speak, Joe, about wondering United States Senator you could talk to.
Can I filibuster? $115. All right. Well, as you know, we've had a debate going on, and it really stretches back to when I was a little kid growing up in Palatine Township in the village of Inverness. I've lived there all my life. In 1969, O'Hare first reached capacity. And just a few years after O'Hare had its first grand opening in 1963, where President Kennedy appeared with the old Mayor Daley for the official grand opening of O'Hare that really got started in the 50s. And O'Hare quickly became just a powerhouse of an airport, attracting business from all over the country. But in 1969, the demand for O'Hare started to exceed its capacity for the first time, and it was that year that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, decided to impose caps on how many flights there could be at O'Hare. And the reason they imposed those caps was because there was virtually an unlimited demand for O'Hare, but they didn't have capacity to take any more than that they were already having. Well, for many years, those caps were in place, and that helped to forestall delays at O'Hare because it wasn't possible for the airlines to schedule more flights than the airport had capacity for. Now, if you fast forward to just 1999, there was a congressional effort led by the airlines, United and American and all the airlines in the country, to lift the caps, to have Congress come in and override the regulations the FAA had put in place and lift those caps on the number of flights at O'Hare, and also at LaGuardia, where they also had caps, and at Washington National Airport, which were also capped. And as soon as Congress lifted those caps, and I was opposed to the lifting of those caps, and I said on the Senate floor, if we lift those caps, delays are going to go up exponentially because you're going to have many more planes trying to land and take off that the airport has capacity for. And in fact, the FAA had many internal studies showing that if they took off the caps, delays would go up exponentially. Well, the airlines got what they wanted. They took off the caps, and what happened? Delays went up exponentially at O'Hare almost immediately. Now, at LaGuardia, they have reimposed flight caps because the delays got so bad at LaGuardia, they got worse than they were at O'Hare. And the Port Authority that runs LaGuardia asked for federal assistance in reimposing the caps. The FAA did help reimpose the caps, although I think their legal basis for doing so is somewhat suspect. In fact, I've been told that because Congress removed the authority to do the caps. At Chicago, what happened is after all these delays were generated, and I would think they were perfectly predictable, is that those who favored the expansion of O'Hare used this as evidence that we needed to expand O'Hare Airport. Well, I think that if it were feasible to expand O'Hare, we would have done so long ago. But the fact of the matter is it really isn't practical or feasible to expand O'Hare because they're out of room. O'Hare's on only 7,000 acres. They have 7 runways, and there's no place to put more runways. It's very, very difficult to do. In fact, if you go back to 1984, the FAA first suggested that the Chicago area needed to build a 3rd supplemental airport. That led to an FAA City of Chicago study called the Chicago Airport Capacity Study that was conducted between 1986 to 1988, I guess, and they came up with a recommendation for a south suburban site for the 3rd airport. And in that report, they more or less dismissed Gary because it's in Chicago's airspace, and they also concluded that Rockford was too far out to be a Chicago supplemental airport. So, going forward then, Governor Edgar started to move on building the 3rd airport in a site now known as Peatone. Mayor Daley at that time tried to counter with a 3rd airport that would still be within his political jurisdiction at the Lake Calumet site. And Governor Edgar decided to go along with that. However, the state legislature stopped that plan. They thought that was unworkable because there was too many environmental problems that arose when you tried to build at Lake Calumet. And once that got scuttled, then Mayor Daley went to the Clinton administration and had them remove the South Suburban Airport, the Peatone Airport, from the so-called NIPIAS list, the National Plan for Integrated Airport Systems in this country, thereby making Peatone ineligible to ever get federal funding. Had Mayor Daley not done that, it's my guess that we could have a 3rd airport already operating in the south suburbs. Now, keep in mind, Mayor Daley's father, and some of you will remember this, in the early 70s, he proposed a 3rd airport. And how many of you remember that? He proposed an airport in Lake Michigan. Who remembers that? Please raise your hand. So many of us do remember that. This has been going on a long time. This is not a recent last couple of years issue. Our area has been batting around this idea for years and years. In any case, I believe that the essential crux of our problem in the Chicago area is we do need more capacity, and I believe you get more capacity more quickly at less cost by going forward and building the 3rd airport on a greenfield site in the south suburbs. The state's proposed Peatone Airport would cost about $6 billion to build. It would have 6 parallel runways on 24,000 acres that would have capacity for 1.6 million operations a year. It would have the same footprint or be of the same size and similar cost to the Denver International Airport. And in my judgment, it's much easier to get the capacity by going forward with the 3rd airport. When you get into trying to tear up and rebuild O'Hare, it gets very expensive and very questionable. Now, the plan that Mayor Daley and Governor Ryan came up with would have 6 parallel runways at O'Hare, but since they're cramped in only 7,000 acres and they're bounded by the 294, the tri-state on the east, and on the north they're bounded by the Northwest Tollway. There's Irving Park Road to the south. There's Route 83 to the west. They don't really have any place to put this. So what Mayor Daley and Governor Ryan's plan does is it would request a waiver from the normal spacing requirements required by the FAA for parallel runways. The FAA typically requires 4,300 feet separation between runways for simultaneous takeoffs and landings. And the mayor and the governor's plan, they have two sets of parallel runways that would only be 1,300 feet apart, which in my judgment raises obvious safety issues. Do we really want to be skirting the line when it comes to safety? Now, to do Mayor Daley and Governor Ryan's plan properly, I think O'Hare's footprint would nearly have to be tripled. You'd probably have to get it up to about 21,000 acres instead of the 7,000 acres that they have. And that would mean tearing up way north of the Northwest Tollway and way south of Irving Park Road. And the cost would just be absurdly prohibitive. So I favor going forward with the South Suburban Airport. I obviously have people who oppose that point of view, namely United and American would like to keep O'Hare as the only major facility in the Chicago area. Midway is a large airport. However, the runways are very short at Midway. The longest runway at Midway is only 6,000 feet, so that makes it all but impossible for long-haul operations to be conducted out of Midway Airport. And in my judgment, United and American have, and I think their executives are doing the right thing for their shareholders. Their objective here would be, in my judgment, to block new entrants other than United and American from coming in and competing with them in the Chicago market. United and American have over 80% of the market at Chicago O'Hare Airport. It's not in their interest to have other airlines coming in and competing with them in the Chicago area. And in fact, airlines all across the country that have a Fortress Hub airport, like Delta does in Atlanta, TWA, which is now part of American, has a Fortress Hub at Lambert Field in St. Louis. Northwest has a hub in Minneapolis and in Detroit and also in Memphis. In all those cases, those airlines fight any new airports because they don't want new entrants coming in and competing with them. And in fact, even though passenger travel has increased 400% since aviation deregulation in the late 70s, we have built only one new major airport in this country, and really it wasn't an additional airport, it was just a replacement airport, and that is the Denver airport, which is a replacement, and the FAA shut down Stapleton Airport in Denver so that it was still hard for new entrants to break into the Denver market. But I think consumers in the Chicago area would benefit by having more service choices. I think United and American are great companies. I have great respect for not only their executives, but also their employees. I'm very proud to have them in Chicago, but my duty is not to represent the shareholders of United and American. I have a broader duty to the whole state, and I think consumers statewide would benefit by having additional options. Now, finally, and I will go to questions after this, the one point I would like to make is I have a different obligation being a statewide elected official than the mayor of the city of Chicago does. His obligation is to the city of Chicago, and he would like to see all economic activity that he can get within his political jurisdiction. But representing the entire state, I view this a little bit more broadly for the whole Chicago area and the Illinois region. I don't think it's in the interest of our state to concentrate all our economic activity in one tiny 7,000 acre site out in the northwest suburbs. That area is already bustling with economic activity to the point that the people don't want any more. And in fact, the issues in the northwest suburbs are about how they can stop growth. And there are all sorts of groups in, say, Lake County and northwest suburban Cook County and DuPage County that are anti-growth because the people are fed up. There's too much congestion. And I've got all these other parts of the state that are dying for an economic engine. And it's not just the northwest side of the city and the northwest suburbs that need an economic engine. We have areas all over the state that need economic growth and activity. And of course, everywhere just about in downstate Illinois needs more economic activity. But one of the most forgotten regions of our state is the south suburbs. And they need an economic engine desperately. A third airport in the south suburbs, in my judgment, would help spread some of the economic activity around the Chicago area. And I, in that regard, associate myself with the sentiments of Congressman Jesse Jackson, who has been working very hard to bring economic activity to his 2nd District of Illinois. And I think ultimately we'll have more capacity if we go forward with Peatone. We'll have 1.6 million operations a year on top of the 900,000 plus that they're running at O'Hare, plus we'd still have Midway. That's more than not going forward with Peatone, trying to double O'Hare and bringing it up from 900,000 to 1.6 million operations. Incidentally, I don't think it's feasible to both greatly expand O'Hare and build Peatone. And if I were to disagree with my friends at the Chicago newspapers, if I may respectfully disagree, I don't think editorial positions that argue for both Peatone and the expansion of O'Hare are reasonable. I think we can't straddle the issue. It has to be one or the other. If you double the size of O'Hare, there's no need for Peatone. And all the state's whole premise for building Peatone has been that O'Hare couldn't be expanded anymore, that it wasn't feasible to do it, and we need to have some other way to meet the capacity demands for our regions. So with that, let me go to questions, and that leaves plenty of time for questions. Do you want to moderate on these? Okay. You'll keep order.
Supposed to moderate, but also to point out that 42nd Ward Alderman Bert Nateris is here. He's very shrinking violet. Peter Fitzgerald, the first question will be mine. How hopeful are you that that Peatone will be resurrected?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that the governor's race right now is so important. All the candidates for governor are being asked their positions on airport. I think, frankly, Governor Ryan is in the last months of his administration. He and Mayor Daley came to an agreement to ask Congress for federal legislation that would prevent a future governor from getting out of it. And I'm going to do all that I can to prevent that federal legislation from happening. I hope it won't happen. I'm sure Margaret's boss, Senator Durbin, is going to try and do all that he can to make sure that it happens. But keep in mind that that law Senator Durbin is pushing preempts state law. The agreement between Daley and Ryan is not an agreement between the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago because the state legislature wouldn't go along with that, in my guess. And that's why they had to go to the federal government and request that the federal government override state law. And that really was the crux of the legislation being pushed in Washington. They need that legislation because they can't get through the state legislature, and they couldn't get through perhaps a state permitting process if there's a new governor who has a difference of opinion on it. I think it's going to be nip and tuck as to whether Peatone ever gets built, and a lot will depend on who the next governor is.
Okay. Let me also point out that we see a lot of new faces here in the City Club, people who are here for the first time or second time that are not members. Let me tell you that we urge you to join the City Club of Chicago for the princely fee of $50 a year. You can join the City Club. So it's a group of the people. People standing up in line are going to be asking questions. Yes, your name and your identification, please.
I'm Joyce Saxon. I'm on the governing board of City Club. Senator, getting back to Enron, I'm sure that everybody will work very hard so it doesn't happen again that people lose their life savings. Is there anything that can be done legally to help the people who have lost them to restore some of that money?
Short of a government bailout, I think it's very difficult. The Enron stock is now worthless. And in fact, the New York Stock Exchange just delisted Enron stock this morning. Short of a government bailout, I don't know how to bring that money back to the shareholders. I think it's very unlikely the creditors of that company are now going to own the company. But we can pass laws that limit an employee's exposure to a company's own stock in their 401k. That would be one thing to prevent this sort of debacle from happening again.
Senator, I'm John Cox, and I'm looking forward to joining you in the Senate. And I congratulate you on your principled position on this issue as well as the bailout, both of which I do agree with. Like you, I grew up in the suburbs, but I grew up in the south suburbs, and I lived in the north, and I lived in the west suburbs, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that the south and southwest side of the Chicago...
So your question is?
Very soon, thank you, Tom. Another filibuster, yes. Two issues. First of all, let me get your opinion on high-speed rail for this area, a positive solution to solve our problems, as well as the possibility of a regional transportation authority that shares power and authority over O'Hare and Peatone and gets the mayor involved in solving this problem.
Yeah, one of the problems we have in the Chicago area is the city of Chicago owns O'Hare, but it mainly affects people in the suburbs because it's right out there in the northwest tip of the city. And then you have other airports that aren't being used adequately, such as up in Rockford, where they have two wonderful runways, a 10,000 and an 8,500-foot runway. And we have no regional authority to plan on the adequate usage and limited usage of all facilities. In the Washington, D.C. area, where they have Washington National and Dulles Airport, they have a regional authority that governs those two airports and makes sure Washington National isn't overused and that Dulles is used and so forth. And both of them are very well matched now in capacity, and you don't have all these delays coming out of there. I think a regional authority is something we should look at with respect to airports, a regional board that would run a third airport plus Midway and O'Hare plus Rockford Airport to make sure that they're all used and that it benefits consumers and customers the most. Now, I got a feeling if Alderman Nataras would ask Mayor Daley his opinion on giving up O'Hare authority over O'Hare and Midway.
Why don't we schedule a special luncheon for you, Bert?
Well, I could argue about those landing fees are paid by you indirectly because all of you, that's built into your ticket day. The landing fees, in my judgment, are no more the airline's money than Walmart can claim your money that they collect in sales tax from you when they add it onto the receipt. And Mayor Daley and Governor Ryan's bill in Washington would have taken $13 billion of taxpayer money to expand O'Hare and potentially left the airlines off the hook on that. He had another question, which was high-speed rail. Look, I think high-speed rail is a good idea, but it's a real difficult objective to achieve, and I think it's probably unattainable on a national level. You could have some short-haul high-speed rail links, but our railroad infrastructure is essentially 150 years old in this country, and it's just an enormous amount of money. I don't think Amtrak is a good mechanism to do it. Amtrak has been very inefficient. We may have to devolve parts of Amtrak to consortiums of states like Illinois and Wisconsin and Indiana and Missouri could perhaps get together and have their own high-speed rail link. It's not that I'm opposed to the federal government putting money into Amtrak. In fact, we subsidize airports, we subsidize surface transportation, we build highways for truck traffic, we improve locks and dams on the Mississippi and other rivers for barge traffic. So I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that we make trains different and say you can't have any federal support. I mean, there's probably going to be some, but we got to do it wisely.
Senator, I'm very proud of the way you present yourself, present your case. I'm very pleased to have you represent the state of Illinois. I have a couple of questions. One is, here in the state of Illinois, the current governor is facing a deficit of about $500 million. I was curious, how would you suggest that he attempt to accommodate that deficit? Right now, the proposals are to balance a lot of that on the backs of the poor, what have you. The second question I have, and I think this is probably a very pressing issue, is about Enron and the whole auditing system here in the United States. Is auditors are supposed to confirm and verify that the books are accurate and that they're following basic accounting principles. When we see a major accounting firm like Anderson doing what they've done with Enron, I think it raises enormous questions about the validity of the whole auditing system. And I'm wondering if Enron is just one example of many, many other Enrons that are currently in our system here in terms of flawed, very erroneous presentations of their earnings, what have you. So I'd like you to speak to both of those issues, if you would.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a thoroughgoing review of the accounting and auditing system in this country. The rules that the auditors are supposed to follow will have to be reviewed, but also whether there should be any regulation or oversight of how auditing is done. We don't do that at the federal level right now. Nobody regulates the accounting profession, and there might be a call for such regulation. We have to do more to protect people. But I do think there are some accounting rules that are problematic. How many of you have stocks in some company, directly or indirectly? Now, most of the companies that you own stocks in, they will issue stock options to their executives. How many of you think you own stock in a company where the company issues stock options as compensation to their executives? Just about all of you, the same answer. A few years ago, the accounting profession proposed a crackdown on how stock options are accounted for. You may not realize this, but when a company issues stock options as compensation to their management, they don't have to record any expense at all on their income statement. But they get a tax deduction for it. They get a tax deduction for the full value of the options on their tax returns, but they're not disclosing it to investors on their income statements. Now, a couple years ago, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, the accounting profession, tried to change that. What happened? Congress got involved, egged on by the executives at all these companies, and they found Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut to be their champion. And Senator Lieberman put a gun to the head of the Financial Accounting Standards Board and forced them to back down. He passed a resolution in the Senate calling upon them not to introduce that new rule. Now, I had my staff investigate the effect of Senator Lieberman's efforts on Enron's earnings. The conclusion that my staff gave to me was that Enron's earnings were overstated by 10 to 11% last year, simply because they did not have to record an expense for the stock options.
That's amazing.
They do have to list it in a footnote, but almost all the income of companies throughout America are overstated because they don't record any expense for issuing stock options. And if stock options aren't compensation, what are they? And if compensation isn't an expense on a corporate balance sheet, what is it? That was Warren Buffett's quote. So that's just one example of accounting problems, and Congress has not had a good role in that. Now, with respect to the state's books, I am getting too far away from the state government. I was there for 6 years as a state senator, and now my focus has been on the federal government. I'm sure that there are cutbacks that could be made. They shouldn't be done on the backs of people who are relying on Medicaid benefits. Those are the people who need that help most. I'm sure there's plenty of fat, and perhaps some of these building projects that have been done by the state of Illinois in the last few years could be deferred or eliminated in order to find a balanced budget for the state of Illinois.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Channel 21.
In Evanston, or is it in Chicago?
No, throughout the city of Chicago.
Throughout the city of Chicago.
Other suburbs, too. Check your local listings.
Okay.
Back to Enron. This Sunday morning, Wolf Blitzer's on his show on Sunday morning, with CNN show with Wolf Blitzer, I think it's late edition, showed an analysis of the price of Enron stock, and I think it indicated that the price of Enron stock had fallen from in the spring of last year in the 70s and 80s to $15 as of October 26th. But what it emphasized, and I think I've seen this on no other media, nor any other politician, that employees at Enron were free to sell their stock, the great majority of their stock, up to October 26th, when most of the decline in their wealth in their portfolios had occurred. At that time, that's when there was a change in the administrator plan, and that put a block on the stock. Well, a lot of politicians are running around, I don't think you, Senator Fitzgerald, but a lot of politicians are running around talking about the need for legislation to restrict the right of employees to own stock in their company, or at least the amount that they can invest in their own company, predicated on the notion that they were blocked at selling stock as their wealth was declining in their portfolio. So I wondered, do you agree with that analysis, which I've just summarized? And if so, what are the implications of that, if any, for the kinds of legislation that should be coming from Congress or not coming from Congress with respect to the restrictions on employee ownership in their own company stock?
Well, Jeff, I think you raised two distinct issues. One is, should employees, when a 401k benefits manager is changed from one company to another, should there be a lockdown period in which the employees are prevented from selling? That was clearly part of the problem here. That's one issue, and I think we might be able to look at that and see whether we can't preserve the right of employees who own money or own investments in their company in a 401k plan. We can't enhance their right to sell even when there's been a change in benefits manager. Separate issue is, should there be a cap on the amount of a 401k that can be invested in the employing company's stock? And I do think there can and perhaps should be a cap on that amount, because we would be more likely to prevent future such Enrons if we, in effect, required some diversification in the 401k. Enron would match their employee contributions to their 401k by giving them more Enron stock. And people were, many employees were on their own buying more Enron stock, and that looked like a good idea for many years, but it ultimately was disastrous for people who stayed in to the end. I think it might be prudent to cap how much can be invested in the employing company's stock.
Good afternoon, Senator.
Good afternoon.
My name is Howard Kenner. I'm a member of the Illinois General Assembly, and I'm also one of those worried CPAs that you identified earlier. And I'd like to, too, go back to the Enron fiasco. You identified a number of rules that you see as being problematic within the accounting profession. I would just like to point out that, first of all, as with any profession, rules are changed after you identify problems, and
Right.
you can't really anticipate these things in advance. Are you suggesting that Congress should make the unprecedented move of coming in and regulating the accounting profession? Are you willing to sit down and see how the accounting profession first comes up, the FASB comes up with their rules, and then see how that works? Are you willing to work with them? How do you propose that this should be worked out? Thank you.
Well, Howard, I have come to no conclusions, and he hits a really good question, because Congress has never before specified what the accounting rules are going to be. We've always left that to the accounting profession. Now, in this case, we've identified several problems. One would be the problem of those off-balance sheet partnerships. Enron was incurring huge amounts in debt, and they were able, consistent with accounting profession standards, to keep that debt off their balance sheets by claiming the debt was owned by a partnership, even though the partnership was mainly made up of Enron and just 3% of some other partner. Those debts should not have been off of Enron's balance sheet. Also, the whole issue about how Enron was recording revenues. They were counting their customers, the total value of their customer trades, as revenues of Enron. Those all need to be looked at. I'm not suggesting now that Congress set the rules. In fact, I think that could be disastrous. The rules could be worse. You saw Senator Lieberman's effort to put a gun to the head of FASB when FASB was attempting a crackdown on stock options accounting. But perhaps there needs to be some oversight of the accounting profession. There is no regulator for the accounting profession at the federal level. There isn't for lawyers either at the federal level. But it's something that we have to discuss. I don't know, maybe the SEC should have greater powers to review accounting rules. I don't know what the answer is, but these are the kinds of issues, Howard, that are implicated here, and it'll take a while to resolve them. Joe, how are you?
Good afternoon, Senator.
Good afternoon.
My name is Joe Wiegand. I'm the Executive Director of Family Taxpayers Network. Speaking of filibusters, Senator, less than 2 years into your first term in the Senate, you filibustered when conference committee reports on appropriations were being heard just weeks before the 2000 elections. And while specifically you brought to light that the proposed Lincoln Library in Springfield might be subject to no-bid contracts and might perhaps be a $50 million library costing $150 million, and we appreciated that, your filibuster also criticized the political culture in Illinois, and you spoke at great length and read newspaper stories about riverboat casinos and leases of state buildings. Yet this morning on WGN Radio, I heard you say that with regards to the upcoming Republican primary for governor, you would simply be neutral and look forward to supporting whichever of the good candidates was nominated. Was George Ryan's decision not to run for re-election enough to fix Illinois' political culture? Or indeed, isn't Pat O'Malley really the only Republican candidate for governor who would change that political culture? Thank you, sir.
Well, Joe, thank you very much. And in fact, the problems Illinois had long predate the current administration, in my judgment. It's been going on for more than 100 years in Illinois. When I tell some of my colleagues from elsewhere in the country about some of the issues of scandal and controversy we have in Illinois, they are amazed. And in fact, my colleague from Wisconsin, Russ Feingold, told me about an old Mike Royko column where Mike Royko made fun of everybody in Wisconsin, called them sissies because they didn't know how to have a real scandal. The big scandal up in Wisconsin that Mike Royko wrote about was some state senator's daughter had used the state senator's public telephone to make a long-distance telephone call. And that got it all into the newspapers up there, and that was the basis for Royko's column. But in fact, we have a long history. If you go back to Big Bill Thompson, who was the mayor of the city of Chicago in the late teens and then early 20s, who was tied into Al Capone and the mob. You had Colonel McCormick, then the publisher of the Tribune, personally went to Herbert Hoover and asked him for a federal investigation of Al Capone. And you had the newspapers railing against Big Bill Thompson and finally ran him and the mob out of town. This has been going on a long time. I do think it's important that you have to elect people that you have confidence in their integrity at all levels of government. And I have taken no position in the governor's race. I don't, to the extent I'm able, I intend to stay clear of primaries, although it's possible that I could change my mind. I do want to say that I served with Pat O'Malley for 6 years. He was a good friend of mine. I have the greatest confidence in his character and reputation. I also do know the other candidates, and I think the Republican Party is blessed to have a number of good candidates this year, and I compliment all those who are involved with the campaign in one way or the other, because if you want to improve your state, that's what you got to do. You've got to get involved.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Joe.
Joe, how am I going to top that? The
Now
only
this,
thing
I think, should probably be, we're getting right up, probably be the last one.
The only thing I can add to that is we've both fallen off our roofs.
Okay.
All right, I'm Lou Fryer, a retired banker. A three-part question. They're short. Do you truly believe that you can permanently stop O'Hare expansion? 2, if not, how long can you delay it? And 3, how long will the courts affect expansion?
Wow.
In other words, what can we look forward to?
Well, O'Hare hasn't been expanded for years and years, and that's because it's very difficult to expand O'Hare. I don't believe the city of Chicago could expand O'Hare without the benefit of federal legislation that would mandate it. The legislation that Mayor Daley and Governor Ryan have would require the FAA to expand O'Hare and require that they not consider alternatives. Current FAA process, if an airport proposes expansion, is the FAA does a cost-benefit analysis to see if it makes sense. And if there are other options, such as building a third airport, the FAA won't allow the expansion to go forward. The idea of Mayor Daley's legislation is to stack the deck so that the FAA has to expand O'Hare. And I think only with that legislation could he get it done, because I think in an honest cost-benefit analysis, the FAA wouldn't expand O'Hare because it's too little bang for the buck. You have to spend probably $13 or more billion to expand O'Hare, when a third airport would cost only less than half of that and would bring far more capacity. You get more capacity more quickly at less cost by building
Do
a
you
third
think
airport.
you can prevail?
Well, I will work as hard as I can.
no.
I don't know. I think it'll be hard. I will work hard.
Okay.
That's what I said I would do during the campaign, and that's what I've been doing.
One quick one, Senator Fitzgerald. Jerry Roper with the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. I had about 4 questions to ask you, but some of your comments earlier led me to this question. What do Mayor Craig Johnson and the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce and the other business organizations now out around O'Hare tell the 2,600 businesses in the Elk Grove Park that you have now made the decision that O'Hare cannot expand and we need to build in the south suburbs?
Well, I think that O'Hare would continue to be a strong, vibrant airport, and those businesses would still be there. I would be concerned if they built the ring road proposed by Mayor Daley, because depending on where it could go, it could take out as much as 20% of the Elk Grove Industrial Park, which employs 100,000 people. And I am told that potentially under certain configurations of that ring road, as many as 30,000 jobs in Elk Grove would have to be removed to make way for that ring road to funnel twice as many people into O'Hare as are now going into. Imagine how congested it is. If you drive out to O'Hare this afternoon, imagine how congested it will be this afternoon. Now think what it will be like trying to get to O'Hare when twice as many people are going to try to get out there, when they're running twice as many operations. It will be an even worse choke point, and there is such a thing as having too good a location. I don't think we should put all of our economic activity right there. Jerry, I think we'd get an overall bigger economic pie in the Chicago metropolitan area if we built a third airport and had 2 major airports in the Chicagoland area. But I'll continue to work with you in the years to come. Someday we'll agree on something. All right. Thank you all very much.